obligation, and silence. Returning to Mrs. Higby's house later that afternoon, Purbright observed her quietly arranging papers by the hearth, the locked box still present on the side table. She greeted him with her customary measured politeness. "Inspector," she said, "you have the air of someone who finds facts more fascinating than gossip." "I am inclined to observe patterns," Purbright replied. "Occasionally, they reveal more than words ever could." She inclined her head, acknowledging the remark without elaboration. "Patterns are sometimes clearer than conversation," she said, "though one must be cautious about what conclusions one draws." "Indeed," Purbright said, "especially when appearances are carefully curated." Mrs. Higby's fingers rested briefly on the locked box, though she made no move to open it. "My husband," she said softly, "preferred his arrangements to remain discreet. I am merely ensuring they are concluded gracefully." Purbright recognized the deliberate vagueness. Her words were true but incomplete. They revealed intent without revealing action. The widow was not merely observing social norms, she was actively shaping them, ensuring that what needed to remain unseen did so without incident. He allowed himself a subtle nod, accepting the controlled ambiguity. "It is a delicate balance," he said, "preserving discretion while satisfying curiosity." Mrs. Higby smiled faintly as though approving the formulation. "Discretion," she murmured, "is an underrated virtue. Far too many in Flaxborough presume it unnecessary." Their conversation concluded with the usual formality, and Purbright rose to leave. His attention, however, was drawn to the hearth once more. A single envelope, unsealed and tucked behind the locked box, bore the faint imprint of handwriting not entirely consistent with Mrs. Higby's usual style. Its edges were slightly singed, suggesting prior exposure to fire, or at least proximity to heat. He pocketed the envelope discreetly. The faint burn marks mirrored almost ceremoniously the pyre where the widow had appeared weeks before. Someone, it seemed, had been transferring private knowledge to paper only to ensure its selective destruction. The act carried an elegance that was both deliberate and intimidating. Morality mediated through omission, influence administered through concealment. As Purbright departed, he noted the winter sun falling obliquely across the carpet, illuminating dust motes like suspended testimony. Outside, the town moved on, oblivious to the subtle manipulations unfolding behind its closed doors. Yet for the inspector, each measured step, each carefully preserved envelope, and each deliberate hesitation contributed to a quiet hypothesis. Mrs. Higby's stewardship extended beyond grief. She was managing memory itself, selecting what Flaxborough might remember and what it would conveniently forget. He walked along the frost-lined
lane with a private awareness. The widow's discretion was both shield and instrument. Somewhere within the papers, ledgers, and fragments of charred correspondence lay the suggestion that the town's moral equilibrium had been both maintained and directed by a single, silent hand. The question that accompanied him, unspoken but insistent, was simple and troubling. Which consequences had she forestalled, and which were still waiting to emerge? By the time Purbright reached the station, the air carried a hint of smoke from distant chimneys and an undercurrent of expectation. The town, as always, proceeded politely and with precision. Yet in that quiet, frost-rimmed light, he knew that even the most controlled appearances could conceal more than they revealed. He carried the envelope in his pocket as a silent witness to the careful, almost ceremonial management of reputation, and perhaps something more. The Flaxborough tea room, at 3:30 on a weekday, possessed the curious stillness of a place whose regulars were devoted more to observation than consumption. The clinking of china and the faint hiss of the kettle were polite interruptions rather than disturbances, and the proprietress, Mrs. Cranley, conducted her work with a decorum that suggested both devotion and vigilance. Patrons were expected to speak softly, smile faintly, and, above all, to observe social cues as if under a subtle inspection of communal propriety. Inspector Purbright entered with deliberate casualness, careful to avoid the impression that his presence was either urgent or investigative. His coat brushed the back of the nearest chair, and he allowed a courteous nod to Mrs. Cranley before taking a seat near the window, where the light fell evenly across the table and encouraged both reflection and discretion. From this vantage, one could see the slow passage of the town's habitual pedestrians. Housewives with wrapped parcels, clerks with stiff postures, and children whose boots produced small, polite echoes on the cobbled street. A soft cough drew his attention to a corner table. Mrs. Tallow, by now a familiar figure in Purbright's observations, sat with a small notebook and a pen poised as though in perpetual readiness to record subtle transgressions. She looked up briefly, gave an imperceptible nod, and returned to her page. The gesture was neither greeting nor challenge, but it carried all the nuance of both. Purbright sipped tea and allowed his gaze to drift toward the centre of the room, where Mrs. Higbee had just entered. Her appearance was measured, almost ceremonial, as if each movement had been considered for its visual and social consequences. She seated herself at a table near the radiator, placed her handbag beside her with exactitude, and ordered tea without any superfluous exchange. Even in this ordinary venue, she projected an authority that was invisible yet unmistakable. Mrs. Tallow, observing this, paused and jotted a single line in her notebook, her pen scratching faintly against the paper. Purbright noted the slight tightening of her lips, a small, polite signal that some social computation was underway. He recognized that the widow Higbee's presence had altered the equilibrium of the room. Every gesture, every glance, every cup of tea now carried latent significance. After several minutes of silence, Mrs. Higbee spoke quietly to the server. "Would you ensure the sugar is fresh?" The tone was not a question but a courteous command dressed in civility. Purbright considered the statement. Even mundane requests in Flaxborough could signal attention, control, or subtle reproach. The sugar might have been fresh before. The point was that it now required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was itself a small social contract. Purbright turned his attention back to the fragment of paper he had found behind the locked box. It rested in his pocket, unnoticed, but persistent in the mind. Someone was directing events with subtlety, ensuring that appearances were preserved while influence quietly moved behind them. He wondered whether Mrs. Higbee's attendance at the tea-room was, in part, an extension of this careful orchestration, the observation of habits, the management of perception, and the indirect guidance of communal anxiety. Mrs. Higbee lifted her cup and sipped. Her eyes, as always, were precise and deliberate, noting the room without apparent calculation. Yet Purbright, attuned to the rhythm of Flaxborough's social dance, suspected she was aware of every observer, every judgment, every latent expectation. Even Mrs. Tallow seemed, after a discreet glance, to recognize that she had not fully mapped the terrain. A young clerk entered and took a table near the window. He glanced briefly at Mrs. Higbee, then busied himself with a notebook, pretending preoccupation. Purbright noted that the clerk's behavior was careful, yet slightly unnatural. A foot-tapping, a hand-brushing hair, a hesitation before drinking tea. Flaxborough's citizens were accustomed to observation, but this suggested the awareness of observation itself, a secondary layer of social anxiety. Mrs. Tallow closed her notebook with a faint snap and left, carrying with her a subtle energy of anticipation. The room seemed lighter for her absence, though not entirely unobserved. Mrs. Higby, still seated, adjusted her scarf, giving the impression of idle comfort while maintaining a controlled poise. Purbright rose, acknowledging Mrs. Higby with a faint nod. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Higby. I trust your tea is satisfactory." "Indeed," she replied, allowing a micro smile. "Although one must always be attentive to details, Inspector. Even the smallest oversight can carry consequence." He inclined his head, understanding that the remark was both casual and pointed. As he stepped toward the door, his foot brushed against a scrap of paper tucked beneath the radiator. He retrieved it and recognized the faint, typewritten text immediately. But she observes all movements. The fragment was brief but unmistakable. It mirrored the previous notes and letters he had collected, suggesting continuity of intent. Someone was recording, directing, and influencing without direct interference, leaving only hints behind. The town's moral and social landscape, it seemed, was being carefully mapped and manipulated. Purbright slipped the fragment into his pocket and paused. He glanced back at Mrs. Higby, who continued to sip her tea with deliberate calm, unaware or unconcerned that the observer had noticed the paper. The subtlety of her orchestration was clear. Every gesture, every presence, every absence reinforced her influence over the town. As he left the tea room, the winter light falling softly across the cobbled street, he reflected that Flaxborough was a town both vigilant and vulnerable, guided by invisible hands. The question that lingered, silent yet insistent, was who, exactly, was being managed, and to what end? Purbright walked on, the faint imprint of the typewritten note pressing against his thoughts, carrying the unspoken suggestion that observation was never idle, and influence was never gratuitous. The town continued its polite, measured rhythm, yet beneath the civility, the games of discretion and subtle control persisted. The streets of Flaxborough in late afternoon possessed a peculiar stillness, as though the town itself were poised between obligations fulfilled and the subtle anxieties of impending gossip. Inspector Purbright, walking at a measured pace, noted the gentle disquiet of the lamps flickering on, the occasional shutter rattling in the wind, and the faint echo of distant conversation filtered through the narrow alleys. Evening, he reflected, was the time when reputations, like shadows, stretched far beyond their proper limits. Purbright's route took him past Mrs. Higby's residence, where the windows glimmered with the soft reflection of candlelight. Inside, she could be seen moving with the same deliberate economy of gesture that had characterized her every public appearance. He observed without expectation the widow's movements were consistent, almost ritualistic, suggesting that even private hours were conducted according to an internal standard of control. There was no haste, no apparent improvisation, yet the precision itself hinted at purpose. Along the lane, he encountered Mr. Grieving, carrying a small bundle of parish documents. The assistant vicar's steps faltered momentarily at the sight of Purbright, as if he feared some inadvertent scrutiny. He gave the inspector a formal nod, which was returned with understated acknowledgment. It was a gesture that spoke volumes more than words could: civility, recognition of social hierarchy, and an almost imperceptible anxiety that the town's delicate moral fabric might be inspected too closely. Purbright continued his walk, noting the subtle signs of observation that threaded through the town. Windows, half open to admit the cold evening air, also served to admit the possibility of quiet surveillance. Curtains adjusted slightly, off-centre, suggested a household aware of its neighbours' eyes. These were minor, almost trivial observations, yet they carried the weight of cumulative social expectation. Flaxborough, he thought, was a town governed by peripheral vision as much as by law or propriety. Ahead, a figure rounded the corner, Mrs. Tallow walking briskly, though with measured steps. She glanced briefly toward the street and then, with deliberate casualness, slowed. Purbright recognized the familiar pattern. She was performing the ritual of observation, moving through the town as a means of collecting the small signals of daily life, yet leaving her presence virtually unnoticed. The social calculus of her habits was as intricate as any official correspondence. A few doors further, he noticed a scrap of paper fluttering at the edge of the gutter, yellowed at the corners. Curious, he stooped and retrieved it. The fragment bore a partial sentence, its typewritten characters faint but unmistakable. Could I not reveal what she has learned? Purbright tucked the scrap into his coat pocket. Its phrasing resonated with the fragments he had already collected. Letters, parish notes, and charred remnants of documents all suggested the deliberate management of information. There was a continuity, a thread of influence running through the town's private and public communications, and Mrs. Higby's presence, quiet, careful, and commanding, was at its center. As he approached the bridge, spanning the small river, the fading light illuminated the familiar ripple of water and the reflective surfaces of nearby windows. Here he paused, allowing the scene to settle in his mind. The bridge was empty, yet its vantage offered an unobtrusive view of several households simultaneously. He noticed a servant leaving one house with a lantern, another household extinguishing lamps in a particular order, and, farther off, the brief flicker of movement behind a drawn curtain. The town in these hours revealed itself through minute, orchestrated gestures rather than overt statements. A faint rustling of leaves drew his attention to the alley beside the chapel. He observed a young boy carrying a bundle of letters, pausing to glance around before dropping them carefully into the letterbox. There was nothing suspicious exactly, yet the boy's hesitation and careful handling suggested he had been entrusted with more than routine correspondence. The manner in which Flaxborough transmitted information was as telling as the information itself. Purbright's thoughts returned, inevitably, to Mrs. Higby. Her management of events, the pyre, the letters, her careful attention to parish committees, was a quiet exercise of authority. The town's citizens, often unaware of the precise mechanisms of influence, adjusted their actions and speech according to subtle cues she provided. Yet, he noted, her influence left gaps, fragments of information, like the scrap in his pocket, that hinted at what she had seen and recorded without making it explicit. He resumed his walk along the frost-lined streets, observing that the evening, with its muted sounds and measured shadows, seemed to encourage both caution and contemplation. The town moved in predictable patterns, yet those patterns were guided by invisible hands, and the ordinary routines carried an undertone of managed expectation. Returning toward the center of town, Purbright paused once more at a corner where two streets met. He noticed the faint glow of candlelight from a second-floor window in Mrs. Higby's house. She was seated, still attentive, apparently reviewing papers or letters, her posture unchanged. The quiet diligence, the deliberate movements, and the near-ceremonial attention to detail suggested a woman fully aware that observation itself is a form of influence. Purbright pocketed the final scrap of paper, aware that it was less evidence than suggestion, a signal rather than a statement. The evening pressed on around him, the town's lights flickering gently, and the question lingered. Whose movements was she guiding, and to what subtle ends? With that, he continued along the lamplit street, the soft crunch of frost beneath his boots accompanying thoughts of discretion, influence, and the imperceptible shaping of reputation. The morning of the second pyre dawned with a clarity that seemed almost formal, as though Flaxborough itself were conscious of an audience. Frost lingered on rooftops and cobblestones, each surface reflecting the pale light with understated precision. Inspector Purbright, arriving early to observe, without intrusion, noted that the streets were almost unnervingly empty, the quiet itself a signal of expectation. The town's usual chatter had been replaced by a collective anticipation, subtle but palpable, as if everyone had agreed to hold judgment until the flames were fully observed. Mrs. Higby appeared promptly at the edge of the square, impeccably attired and carrying a small ledger. Her presence was enough to command both attention and silence, a phenomenon Purbright had observed throughout the investigation. Citizens paused in their careful routines, shopkeepers straightened displays, children slowed their play, and the parish clerks adjusted hats and collars with meticulous deliberation. Even the wind seemed to accommodate her authority, moving unobtrusively around her as she crossed the square. Purbright positioned himself at a respectful distance, noting the arrangement of materials around the pyre. Folders, letters, and small bundles of paper were placed with deliberate spacing, each stack corresponding to a particular household or committee. The organization suggested a procedural logic that was invisible to casual observers, but meaningful to those attuned to Flaxborough's intricate social hierarchy. Mrs. Higby, he realized, was performing a quiet act of governance, converting private correspondence into public propriety through careful, indirect action. Councillor Broom arrived shortly after, his demeanour a mixture of relief and vigilance. He offered Mrs. Higby a bow that was polite, yet edged with the subtle anxiety of one aware that oversight had already been conducted elsewhere. "Shall we begin?" he asked, though the phrasing was redundant. The pyre would begin when Mrs. Higby saw fit. No council authority could accelerate or impede her timing. "Please observe caution," she replied softly, almost formally, "and ensure that only the designated materials are consumed. Accuracy in destruction, as in preservation, reflects upon all of us." Broom inclined his head and stepped back. The citizens gathered in tentative clusters, each watching, each guessing, each calculating what the pyre's contents might imply about their neighbours. The ritual, though mundane in mechanics, carried the weight of reputational judgment. Flaxborough, as ever, assessed itself through the careful observation of symbolic acts. Purbright noted Mrs. Higby's ledger as she recorded each addition to the pyre. Each entry was precise: date, description, household. No note was omitted, no judgment expressed. Yet the act of recording itself imposed order, an invisible architecture upon the chaos of human discretion. He had long suspected that the widow's control extended beyond the immediate disposal of materials. It was an ongoing assertion of social equilibrium, administered with neither spectacle nor censure. As the flames began to lick the first bundles, a faint smell of burning paper mixed with frost and chimney smoke. It was neither alarming nor dramatic, yet it carried the weight of consequence. Each household, each committee, each individual represented in the pyre was acutely aware of the symbolism. The act was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet its implications were profound: discretion enforced, secrets managed, reputation preserved, or at least curated. Purbright observed a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Tallow, notebook abandoned in her hand, lips pressed tightly in reflection. She watched, but her expression betrayed a mixture of fascination and slight unease. Her habitual role as observer was interrupted by the clarity of Mrs. Higby's orchestration. Even those accustomed to scrutiny could sense the deliberate subtlety of the widow's influence. A sudden movement drew his attention. A young clerk from the parish office adjusted a bundle near the pyre, pausing as if reconsidering his participation. Mrs. Higby, with a glance barely perceptible, signalled nothing. Yet the clerk's hesitation was sufficient to suggest that observation alone sufficed to manage action. Influence, Purbright thought, need not be articulated, it only needed recognition. By mid-morning, the pyre was reduced to glowing embers, and Mrs. Higby meticulously noted the completion of each segment in her ledger. She closed it with care, her fingers lingering on the cover, as though affirming the order she had imposed. Citizens began to drift away, each carrying a private sense of relief or contemplation. Flaxborough's equilibrium, at least for the moment, appeared maintained. Purbright lingered until the crowd had dissipated. He retrieved the small scraps he had collected in previous days from his coat pocket, arranging them against the ledger. The consistency was unmistakable: unsigned letters, charred fragments, minor notes, all converging upon a single pattern of control, subtle and continuous. The implication was clear: Mrs. Higby had orchestrated both what the town saw and what it would forget. As he turned to leave, the widow approached, her steps measured and deliberate. "Inspector," she said quietly, "sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest weight. One must observe carefully, or the consequences might escape notice." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, it seems that in Flaxborough observation itself is a form of authority." Her faint smile suggested approval, or perhaps acknowledgment of his recognition. "And authority," she said softly, "requires discretion." She paused as if considering an unspoken thought, then turned and walked back toward her home, her posture precise, her influence quietly evident in the hushed streets. Purbright remained for a moment longer, considering the remnants of the pyre and the quiet compliance of the town. The fragments in his pocket and the ledger in her hand suggested not scandal, but subtle management, the shaping of perception, the careful orchestration of memory. Flaxborough's moral and social fabric had been preserved with elegance, yet beneath the civility lay the unspoken question that persisted for those attuned to nuance: who truly observed whom, and who determined which secrets would endure? With that reflection, Purbright walked away, leaving the glowing embers and the faint scent of burnt paper behind. The town resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet in every household the awareness of observation lingered, subtle and insistent, like a shadow that could not be fully dispelled.